Welcome to a ride on the outside. MMA is full of people on the inside, but what about the ones that watch from beyond? Welcome to the MMA Outsiders with Tom Albano and Zain Bando on the Empty the Bench Podcast Network.
And it's another edition of the MMA Outsiders. I'm Tom Albano along with Zain Bando. And Zain, this is going to be another edition where we're going to be doing a lot of ranting, a lot of raving, a lot of questioning, a lot of looking for answers. And I know that sounds really negative, but a lot of the headlines that we have this week are kind of the negative fashion, I guess we can say.
Yeah, definitely the negative fashion for sure, and I guess that also equates to just the evolution of the nutty sport that is mixed martial arts. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of everything, though, we'd like to remind you guys to please like and subscribe. Please share the show across all forms of social media. Again, you're listening to the MMA Outsiders. This is episode 54. Be sure to like it across social media, share it. Our Twitter handle is at MMA Outsiders ETB. I'm Zain Bando. I'm a staff writer for bjpen.com, which is where you can find all of my combat sports work. And then, of course, to my left is Tom Albano. You can find his work over at Fansided MMA, as well as the PFL website, as we are rounding at the home stretch of the 2023 PFL playoffs. And, of course, the PFL is going to be a major subject in today's discussions, at least for about the first 20 minutes to a half an hour or so. So I guess that's a good segue into continuing my initial point was, yeah, there's definitely a lot of negativity around the news bits this week, but it's almost like every single time in the history of the show where when you and I talk off the air, which is pretty frequently, almost every day to this point, there comes these weeks where we're like, oh, what do we have to talk about? And always right before the show begins, there's a major news nugget that drops, and I guess we can get right into it. It's now looking much clearer, at least, that the PFL and Bellator will be looking to go in some very different directions. It's obviously this merger is looking very likely. Per Al Zelino and Todd Atkins, who we like to mention as well, has had some very big scoops in regards to this whole story. So it looks like it was at the end of Bellator is drawing closer. Bellator just announced an event in Chicago in November that will be contested as Bellator 301. Tom, I know you have something to say, so I'm just gonna let you have the floor.
Okay, so I need to make things really clear for everybody, those of you who are watching us on our YouTube home and those of you who are listening to us on our audio-only platforms. The Bellator PFL story has just gone in completely different directions. And this comes after a significant period of radio silence about this potential merger and what was going to happen and what the plans are. So the original story that we were going to talk about came on the Todd Atkins side, in which it seemed like the merger between Bellator and PFL, the potential sale of Bellator to the Professional Fighters League, talks had ended, things had gone bad, negotiations, and according to Atkins, it was going to be very likely that Bellator will fold after the Bellator 301 card taking place in Chicago in November. Al Zelino, however, as you mentioned, has countered that with a report that, the sale is still on, the talks are still going on, and now earlier before we started recording, adding in citing an unnamed source that the Bellator sale to the Professional Fighters League is now, quote, imminent. And as a little nugget, as a way to explain, what's going on, it appears, according to Zelino, this may not be the end for Bellator, that the idea of them running two different leagues, the Bellator and PFL acting simultaneously, akin to UFC and Strikeforce 2011, at least through 2011 to 2013, that possibility is still there. And at this point, Zain, I'm just throwing my hands up and saying, at this point, I should also make it clear. I try to every time this subject comes up Zain as a Bellator rankings committee member, me doing some freelance work for the Professional Fighters League. Neither of us have any inside information as to what is going on. For the work that we do for our respective organizations, we don't have any inside knowledge. We don't have any scoop. We are looking for answers in the same way that all of you are looking for answers. And at this point, that's all I'm doing, Stan, is I'm looking for answers. I want some sort of explanation as to what's going on, because Don Davis teased a big announcement for August, and we had assumed that at some point it was going to be the official merger between the Bellator and PFL, or the sale of Bellator to the PFL. And it's now September, middle of September. September 19th is when this show airs, and we have no sort of information until these conflicting reports.
Yeah, very well said. And just from a journalistic perspective, I'd like to add to this too, that I'd rather come on here with you and talk about the analytics and what that this means. When it comes to us having the inside scoop, given how big the story is, I would rather not be that guy, and I'm sure you wouldn't be either, because to me, it is the responsibility of the promotions to make this official, and therefore, given that this is a huge potential business transaction, it's only fitting that it's the promotion's job and only the promotion's job to affirm that this is going to move forward as it's going to. So just to piggyback off of what you were saying, I'd rather be the analytical guy and explain to all of you what this means instead of trying to tell you information that you can find out elsewhere from the people that are actually inside the companies. I just want to make that very clear.
You're right. But now there's a couple of different angles that we can look at, because I remember earlier in the summer we had talked about, okay, if Bellator is being acquired by the Professional Fighters League and it's going to be absorbed, that a lot of fighters were going to be, out of jobs. And now, Sam, it looks like, per the reports of Atkins and Zelino, because Zelino, he has worked with you over at bjpen.com. He is a very respectable and very credible journalist. So I want to give him his props, and I want to respect his reporting. But I can't completely discredit the reporting of Todd Atkins, because if you remember, Zan, this Bellator PFL story originally started with him, and people discredited him until somebody like Helwani,
including us.
Correct, including us. And then when Helwani made mention of how it is real, like, we have to give Atkins his flowers too. I'm just saying, Zan, at this point, it's funny now that we're on two complete extremes with their reports, because if Zelino was right, Bellator is still running. It's just going to be owned by the PFL, which is actually going to bring up the question that I had a few weeks ago about how would they be able to run the two leagues. Like, when a fighter gets signed, are they going to PFL? Are they going to Bellator? How is that going to work out? And then on the Todd Atkins end, I think it's something even worse than an absorbing, worse than a merger, because at least with an absorbing and a merger, Zan, you could still, if you're PFL, theoretically have, Bellator versus PFL title fights at the soonest possibility. If Bellator just completely folds, all those fighters are out of a job for at least for some point. All the people who work backstage at Bellator are out of the job, at least for some point. So this is two levels of extreme at this point.
Oh, 1,000%. And I guess I will say this as neutrally as I can put it. I think for the betterment of the sport, and considering how strictly number one the UFC currently is and has been for so many years, the worst thing that can happen in this scenario is what Todd Atkins is proposing. Because if you take Bellator completely out of the picture, that only leaves three major promotions left in the entire spectrum of MMA instead of just four. And I think, considering with how long Bellator has been around, with how stable Scott Coker has been able to keep it for the last 8 or so years, and to be able to build these homegrown stars like an AJ McKee, for example, the worst possible scenario in this whole thing is Bellator going away, considering that the lack of MMA competition is something that people in the MMA media space and just fans in general have complained about for years. So, quite frankly, although I shouldn't really have a rooting interest in this, I would like to hope and hear that Al Zolino's report is 100% correct, because the last thing you would want is all of these, scheduled tournaments and major fights that Bellator has been trying to pencil in for months and years to just not come to fruition. So that's where I stand on that. I will say, though, from a business venture, if PFL absorbs Bellator and PFL owns it, it's a win-win for ESPN and ESPN Plus. We've been griping on them for weeks and weeks now over price increases. You want to talk about now owning the two biggest MMA promotions in the world? To have both of those promotions on one platform would be absolutely astronomical for all parties involved.
Yeah, because my thought process, and I think you're going on, is that if it's the Zolino report and the PFL is sold and Bellator is sold to the PFL and Bellator is still running like its own organization, that would have to mean a move from the Viacom networks to Showtime and CBS to ESPN Plus, essentially, which would mean, imagine this scenario, Zain, which you're kind of going to, UFC, Bellator, and PFL all under the same umbrella. That would be insanity. That would be unimaginable just a few years ago.
Unimaginable, number one, and number two, I think you'll get into a situation where all three promoters, I guess newly minted UFC CEO Dana White, we're no longer calling him the president anymore. It was weird to even say that. I have a theory as to why about that in a little bit. I'll get to that here in a second, but you might have a situation where Davis, Dana White, and Scott Coker are all butting heads for the best talent in the world, and are all going to be fighting under one major network, which could turn into a little bit of, what boxing used to be back in the day, where it used to be a battle of the promoters, and if the promoter didn't have the fighter sign that they wanted, they were basically screwed. So MMA could really change in one of the craziest ways ever, and you could see a lot of crossover that maybe you weren't expecting just 5 years ago, assuming that they run separately. Now, if the PFL absorbs Bellator, you have a lot of interesting matchups there. Obviously, the tournaments aren't one of them likely going to continue, but I think it'll really give the UFC a run for its money if they end up absorbing, because now you have just as big of a roster as the UFC, between 500 and 700 fighters that you're absorbing completely, which means it'll be two kings at the table, one championship off to the side, and everybody, and then everybody else below that, which is crazy to think that we could maybe have in 3 to 6 months time 2 major MMA promotions, and that's it. So
it is insane. But if they run as two different leagues, I could definitely see, Zain, at least some crossover. So, as you're referring to, you could see very well in a Bellator PFL sale, you could see Ryan Bader versus Francis Ngannou. You could see Chris Cyborg versus Kayla Harrison still happening. So there's a lot of tempting fresh matchups there.
Which is a fight that people have been waiting to see for over a year and a half. So anyone who thought Chris Cyborg versus Kayla Harrison potentially being dead might be mistaken. So it's very interesting. So I have to piggyback this off to you. So I'm just curious, from a neutral perspective, which report do you think, in your opinion, is more likely, and which one, as an MMA fan and longtime consumer of the sport, would you rather see happen, and why?
Well, I'll tell you with the second question, Zain. Absolutely, Al Zolino's. Absolutely, I want to see the nuttiest that is Bellator being sold to PFL, and all three leagues are still running, and I could definitely see just how great that is for the sport, where there's multiple options for fighters. I'm just curious, Zain. I should have made this mention prior to that, because we mentioned how all three of them could be under the ESPN umbrella. Could that open, because obviously, we're not the biggest experts with the fight, legal stuff. For instance, the antitrust lawsuit against the UFC. We had talked about it previously a few weeks ago, but we had encouraged you guys to check out John Nash's reporting on it. I'm wondering, Zain, in that kind of scenario, does that open ESPN up to a potential, antitrust kind of lawsuit? And I only say that, I hope I don't sound dumb, but it's like all the three biggest MMA promotions under the same roof, under the ESPN banner. It almost comes off as monopolistic.
Yeah, that's very interesting you bring that up. I didn't think of it that way. And it's not really related to monopoly stake stuff, but just to even think about the madness of a potential ESPN MMA schedule with those three promotions under the same roof. I would not want to be schedule makers trying to figure out what weekends the UFCs go, what Fridays Bellator goes, and what random Wednesday and Friday's PFL would go in the summer. It would be just absolute chaos.
Not to mention that if Top Rank has a boxing card at some point. Not to mention any of the other boxing promotions that are seen on ESPN. And Zain, let's add to the craziness, because you mentioned Dana White is now the CEO of UFC, and that's because of the official merger between the UFC and the WWE, now under the TKO umbrella on Wall Street. Could you imagine, Zain, if one of those WWE properties, a Raw, a SmackDown, or the pay-per-views, the premium live events, I should say, that are now on Peacock through the WWE network there, imagine if ESPN gets into that boat too. Like, there is a potential craziness that could happen within the next few years with the ESPN's combat sports schedule.
Yeah, I mean, it's mind-boggling to even think of that scenario at this point. As well as, I actually am just going to go out on a limb and say that I think Dana being the CEO now opens up the door for who his successor will be by the time he retires as quote-unquote UFC president. And I actually think all of this madness being intertwined probably means that Hunter Campbell at some point in 2026 or 2027 is going to step in and be the new face of the UFC whenever this new era of MMA issue comes out. I think we're slowly starting to see the wheels in motion. And if you couldn't tell, as Tuesday's Dana White Contender Series, Dana had some interesting and parting words to say that he's very interested to see what happens with this merger. Even though he doesn't like to talk about his competitors very much, you could tell that, and as Dana likes to say, whenever someone tries to compete with him, he's all in. So I think he's watching this with a very close eye. People tell him what's going on. I think he's very fascinated by all of the rumblings that are happening outside of his precious three letters, if you will.
For sure. So, yeah, as a longtime fight fan, I want Salino's report to end up being true. That being the case, the fact that Todd Atkins has been, building a steady name for himself this year, kind of, as a, what's it called? From the neutral journalistic standpoint, I'm still leaning towards Zelino, but it's one of those things where it's like, it's not firm. It's like I'm standing on Zelino's side, but I got the side eye towards Atkins. I'm like, what does he know? What kind of sources and scoop does he have, that somebody like a Zelino doesn't?
And I guess it leads to the final point that I wanted to make. Isn't it kind of bizarre to you that now Bellator has announced this blockbuster Bellator 301 card, which happens to be the third Chicago card in less than a year, which I'm going to be lucky enough to go to? But isn't it weird to you that if it's truly the end of Bellator, they didn't end on a nice even keel like a Bellator 300, that it would have to potentially just end with Bellator 301? Like, that's kind of lame a little bit.
I understand your point. I would be a little happier that they're doing it. I can't even say that because 300 is in California where they're based. I'm just worried, Zain, that is the fact that he announced Bellator 301, was that kind of, something that they did because of something that's going on in the negotiations?
Oh, I could, if you were to put a gun to my head and say, Zain, what is the probability that that could really be the case, I would probably give it an 80-20 answer. That meaning 80% yes, it's very likely that they announce Bellator 301 because of something unnamed going on in the negotiations that's pressuring them to do something to blow it out.
Yeah, so my last thought is I'm really hoping Zelino's report is true. I'm hoping that Bellator goes on, that the PFL is going to run it, and just what madness could unfold with everything under the ESPN umbrella, despite what we mentioned the last few weeks about the ESPN Plus point prices. That being said, no disrespect to Todd Atkins, because this is not a shot on him and his reporting, because if he's right, great for him. I just don't think it's good for the sport to just see a promotion like Bellator outright fold. Moving on from that, let's talk an emergency scenario, Zain. If there is a chance that Bellator does go belly up and Bellator does fold, who should the UFC target? Because I have one name in mind. Well, I think there's a universal name or two that are in mind, but I do have one particular name in mind. And I think, Zain, the universal name or names that are going to pop up with which Bellator fighters should be signed, the Pitbull brothers.
Yeah, those for sure. For me, I would say Usman Nurmagomedov's one. Brett Primus, I would consider him. Sabatello, Stotts, AJ McKee, Johnny Eblen. Even
that was going to be the name I had, is Johnny Eblen, because I feel like he is such a talent that's not really talked about, that needs more eyes on him, that in the case of a Bellator folding, the UFC or PFL should look at Johnny Eblen, or funny enough, his opponent this coming weekend, Fabian Edwards. I mean, how could the UFC pass up on the opportunity to sign Leon Edwards' brother?
Yeah, for sure. And back on the Eblen side, you want to talk about an upgrade to a middleweight division that seems to be in a logjam with the top four. That's as big of an upgrade as you could get. Probably the biggest Bellator to the UFC signing since Michael Chandler a couple years ago. That would be one of them, or the one if they decide to go that route. Of course, you cannot forget the potential to re-sign Ryan Bader. Obviously, Ryan Bader was a fixture on the Ultimate Fighter several years ago. It's still proven to be a pretty big draw. Would be a nice fresh upgrade to the heavyweight division, considering we don't know what the future of John Jones or Stipe Miocic will look like after November 11th of this year. So there are a lot of options that the UFC could go with. It might end up becoming a pride situation where if it does fold, they're going to sign as much of the roster, as little of the roster as they want, and try to make these champion versus champion fights. They may not make it where the titles are unified, but will make it big enough to where it feels like a champion versus champion fight at least. So,
for sure. So my hope is that a bunch of these, fighters end up getting signed. Obviously, not all of them will. I don't know what the relationship is between the UFC and Ryan Bader. Obviously, Chris Cyborg, fat chance, as Dana has said before, he is out of the Cyborg business. So I think she's going to be the one at the biggest loss. Although, the PFL now has the women's featherweight division, so in that emergency scenario, maybe Cyborg can find a home with the PFL, and then I don't know, would Caleb be willing to go down to 145 at least for a Cyborg fight?
That would be very interesting. That's, I think, the $1 million question going into 2024 is will or won't the Kayla Harrison Chris Cyborg fight happen? And if it does happen, which promotion would happen in? I think that's another layer to the question to consider. One last thing I'd like to add before we move on. If the UFC does sign Raytheon Stotts, it would be a pretty cool revenge story, considering that Merab did knock out Raytheon and looking for a fight. Dana White literally flew out to that card in San Diego to see Raytheon win. He obviously did not win. So it would be very interesting to see if the UFC decided to go that route. and they signed Rafael Stotson. Can he have the UFC career that was essentially stolen from him in about 20 seconds 7 or so years ago? So very interesting.
I don't even think it was 20 seconds. I think it was less than that.
Oh, you could be right. Was it more like 10 seconds?
I think it was more like 10 seconds. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the craziest knockouts anyone's ever seen. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch this Looking for a Fight episode. It's actually a pretty entertaining episode. Just outside of the fight itself, it was a Ring of Combat show, and it actually was pretty entertaining. I think Dana signed a bunch of I went that night with Murat being the biggest name, but just a small little plug for Looking for a Fight. If you haven't seen it, there's a newer-ish episode of him and his crew going to Boston, and it's very entertaining. So if you haven't seen that show, all of the episodes are in a very nice playlist on YouTube, easy and accessible. And this show is not sponsored by the UFC in any way, but if I see something that UFC does that I like, I will be very open and very positive about it.
Sam, by the way, it was right in the middle. It was 15 seconds.
Okay, I was close enough. All right.
Yeah, so it was right in the middle of the two times that we were thinking.
That is funny. That is very funny. You know what? You know what's even weirder to me though? The UFC is just kind of sitting back and waiting. This could be one of the situations too, where it could become an affliction disaster. But we're not at that. We're not at that stage just yet.
No, let's try not to think of that scenario. I kind of wanna put the story of affliction in the back of my mind.
Okay, fair. Okay, sorry to bring back bad memories of 2008. I'm sorry. I had to do it a little bit just to get a small reaction out of you. So I actually got a small kick out of that, which is even funnier for me. So there you go.
Yeah, and I think of the words of the Montage King about affliction, where it was, they made douchebag related MMA clothing. They tried to start their own promotion. It lasted about 3, shows. The third one ended up getting canceled when they were trying to get, I think it was Fedor on that card. Fight ends up falling through. Whole card falls through. Promotion falls through. They go back to producing douchebag related MMA clothing.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I had some of that douchebag related MMA as an 11-year-old. So there you go.
Zan, don't worry. I still have a bunch of tap out shirts in my over there.
Oh, me too. InYourFace.com or ProtectYourNeck.com.
Oh, the 2000s with the UFC was something else.
It really was.
And you know what's funny? Then Tap Out became its own true clothing brand. Ended up having that partnership with WWE, and I still have some Tap Out shirts from the modern era Tap Out.
That's right. Yeah, good point. That's right.
All right, let's go off of the UFC of 2009, and let's go to the UFC of, the rest of 2023 and into 2024. So, Zain, you wanna put your matchmaker, well, I shouldn't say matchmaker, your schedule maker cap on. So here's your opportunity.
Yeah. So just for fun, I was bored a couple of days ago, so I just figured let me reach out to Tom and see what he thinks of my very interesting schedule outlook. So Tom, you've had some time to look at it. I put a lot of thought into what UFC 296 through UFC 309 will look like, and I'm just curious, what were your initial impressions, and can you tell the viewers, because you have it up, what I was thinking?
Yes. So, all right. Here's your thing. Predicting the first half of every UFC pay-per-view event from the end of 2023 into 2024. So we're starting from after 295 because 295 is booked as Jones Miocic. You have for UFC 296 them going with O'Malley and Chita Vera and Edwards and Covington. You have no Conor versus Chandler happening in 2023, although you do have it for 2024.
I do. That is correct.
So your schedule for 2024 looks like this. 297 in Brazil, January 19th for 26, Alex Pereira, Yuri Prohaska for the vacant light heavyweight title.
You buy that? Buy or sell that? What do you think?
I buy it. I don't know if I buy the Brazil location. I do buy Pereira versus It's like I said, Zain. Those 3 fights you have listed: O'Malley, Vera, Edwards, Covington, Pereira, Yuri. If there's no Conor Chandler in December at 296, 2 of those title fights have to go on the 296 card, and whatever's remaining has to go to the 297 card. And that's how it has to be at this point.
1,000%.
That's got to be the UFC's alternate plans if that Conor Chandler thing doesn't go through, which, by the way, September 19th, still no word, less than 3 months out.
Still no word, and we thought we were going to get it during Noche UFC with a couple months to go, literally on the day of a couple months out, and we didn't get it. So,
and it's been a month since 290. It's been a month since 292 in Boston that we thought we were going to get something there.
Didn't get it either.
Yeah, so getting a little ticked at that point. UFC 298, you have on Super Bowl weekend in Sydney, Alexander Volkanovski, Ilya Tapura. Although it looks like I was just seeing, maybe it's just Twitter rumors that, that the Super Bowl weekend card probably isn't happening.
Oh, really? So it wouldn't happen on that weekend at all?
I don't know. I'm still of the opinion of a Super Bowl weekend card, and maybe that's because, Zain, I love the idea the last couple of years of a UFC on the Saturday night and then enjoying the Super Bowl the next day and making a whole big weekend out of it. So I'm siding with you still.
But based on sources that I've spoken to, the Twitter rumors are leaning in that direction. If true, that it would not be Super Bowl weekend, so you could bank on it being the week before the Super Bowl or the week after the Super Bowl. I think nothing is confirmed, of course, but just I wrote that before I knew what I know now, which is it's either going to probably be the week before or the week after the Super Bowl.
Yeah. So here's what I am going to say, though. I think it is a little disappointing that, for all the talk about, the Super Bowl is going to be in Las Vegas, we're the stadium, they're going to make a whole big weekend out of it in Las Vegas. That's the disappointment in my mind.
Me too, but then again, all the craziness with all the NFL events that do have to take place that same week, I don't know how you fit in a UFC media day, a UFC fan experience, and the pay-per-view with the Super Bowl going on literally down the street. I don't see how it's logistically possible, so maybe that's what they're thinking about. Do you still think, though, Ilya versus Volk in the February timeframe makes a lot of sense?
I do, only because for all that I talked about a Max Ilya contenders fight, if you saw the comments from Dana, he's not for a 4 fight, and I understand that. So I guess they're going to go with Volk versus Ilya right away. So I could see that, especially if the pay-per-view for 298 happens in Sydney. This one is interesting. So you're going for 299 based on the idea Jones and Stipe will both retire in November, and that will lead us to a UFC 299 in early March in London. Aspinall, Sergey Pavlovich for the vacant heavyweight title.
That is 100% correct, and although I am going against the yearly tradition of the UFC holding the first weekend in March or in Las Vegas, it is because of special circumstances that I don't think that will be a possibility, and it'll obviously be explained. Just a minute.
Well, we know what that is. So that's whatever the UFC 300, whenever that happens, that's going to be in Vegas. That has to be in Vegas.
Has to be. There's no way it's in South Africa. There's no way it's in the UAE. It's Vegas or West, and that's where UFC 200 was, and that's where UFC 100 was. So there's no reason why UFC 300 wouldn't be. So that's my theory on that.
Okay. I'm cool with Aspinall Pavlovich. My question is, where does Cyril Gane fit in all this? Because they did tease.
Cyril Gane, in my hypothetical scenario, Cyril Gane would be the backup fighter for UFC 299. That's how they would do it.
Because they did tease Cyril Gane, Tom Aspinall as a fight after Gane's win in Paris in September, or earlier this month, I should say.
The reason why I don't think that's going to happen is because Gane has already had his title shot versus Aspinall or Pavlovich. It's those two being or first. So I think the UFC wants to go with as fresh of a matchup as they can.
That's fair. UFC 300, T-Mobile Arena, April 6th, and here's where you have McGregor and Chandler.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we tried this with UFC 200. Of course, McGregor is not on the card. Do you think realistically UFC 300 should be penciled in with the McGregor Chandler fight, or do I have that placed incorrectly in your opinion? What do you think?
I think if you're not going to book it in 2023, then either Super Bowl weekend or UFC 300 is the only way you can go with that fight.
No International Fight Week?
International Fight Week as well. But at that point, Zain, is International Fight Week a little too long considering the timeline that we've gotten for this fight?
I think so, and the hype could be died down by then considering what's going on in all the other divisions.
Yeah. Right, significantly. Just going to run through the rest here. UFC 301, May 11th, you have O'Malley Sterling 2. You say O'Malley's going to win against Vera, and then Sterling gets his rematch.
That's exactly. Yep.
302, in June, you have in Chicago.
Yeah.
There it is. There's your little Chicago bias. You're wearing your shirt. Although I don't know if I can say, all good things about your football team at this point. United Center, Hill versus Yuri. That's interesting. So, okay. So you have Yuri beating Pereira to get his belt back, and now this would be Jamal Hill's turn to fight for the title he'd never lost in the octagon.
That's exactly right. And because Jamal Hill is from Grand Rapids, Michigan, it only makes sense that Jamal Hill headlines a UFC pay-per-view in Chicago. And he's called for it several times, and he trains out of there. So there's no way his wish isn't getting granted in 2024, and if it doesn't, I'll be very, very disappointed.
Fair enough. UFC 303, your International Fight Week in Vegas. You have Strickland versus DDP.
I do.
So
it's a man dreaming here. Okay, hey, this is what I want to see happen, not what I actually think could very well.
Zain, you're talking to the man who is behind the DDP hype train. Of course, I'm going to be for this. But here's my thing. So I guess so. What did you make then of Dana's comments that? He deserves the rematch. I guess we're sticking with our opinion that we disagree, that he got dominated.
Yeah, there's that, number one. And number two, I just think he's going to keep requesting more money and more money in the UFC. He's not going to budge.
What did you think of Cormier's opinion that Izzy needs a rest?
Agreed. He only ever fights in title fights. He's 4-3 in his last 7. Yeah, he needs a break. He needs a tough fight, but he can chill on the 5 rounders for at least a little bit. Yeah.
All right. So as a DDP fan, I'm all with you on that. 304, you have at the end of July, so you have him doing 2 July pay-per-views again, like this year in Salt Lake City or Arizona. Islam Makhachev defending the lightweight title against Justin Gaethje. The only issue, unless you have Oliveira getting his belt back next month,
which I don't, which is why you're seeing the fight as it is. Yeah.
Okay, because the only question I have with that is, it seems that the Abu Dhabi cards, Islam is the guy who's always main eventing. Putting him in a fight against Gaethje in late July, I think is a little questionable.
Keep going. I trust me. I strategically planned it to where Abu Dhabi isn't getting a dud. So
okay. 305 in August, Miami, Edwards versus Chimaev. Yeah, I could buy that if Chimaev wins. Now, in my opinion, a win over Paulo Costa should not grant you a title shot because Paulo Costa is, I don't understand how he's still a top contender, but that the UFC is going to do everything in its power to get Khamzat Chimaev a title shot.
For sure. Yep.
Okay, let's see the rest. Going back down. Okay, the second half.
Okay.
Ooh. Mexican Independence Day weekend next year is when you have the rematch between Grasso Shevchenko.
Yep, a year of buildup. That's what I think. It only makes logical sense. The UFC has hinted at an event in Mexico next year. That's the only fight realistically that's a title fight that makes sense to do in Mexico. So do it.
I guess it actually kind of makes sense only in that, and we'll talk about it, you have to give the next title shot again to Shevchenko. You got to do the trilogy fight. But Shevchenko also broke her thumb supposedly during that fight. So
yeah, and I feel like a year off would be enough time to heal the injured thumb. Well, I was also thinking about that as I was building the schedule too. And just given that the UFC wants to try to make this an annual thing, that's the fight you do. And yeah, that was my thought process behind that. Unless you really want to do, Brandon Moreno versus Pantoja as well in that card, or as a potential main event, you can do that too. But I feel like Grasso Shevchenko, with how good the third fight or the second fight was, rather, it deserves a pay-per-view billing, and I think that's what they'll do with it. So,
all right. Okay, now I see. Okay, this is interesting what you're doing with the Abu Dhabi, the 307. October 19th makes sense timeline-wise compared to the previous years. You have Chimaev versus Adesanya, Strickland, or DDP.
Yeah, I think you're going to see some madness in the middleweight division, and this is part of that madness. So, as you probably have alluded to, I'm assuming that Strickland is going to fight DDP, but I think Adesanya fits into that puzzle somehow. And Chimaev is crazy, and he's fought at both middleweight and welterweight. So my theory was, if he loses the welterweight title, he's just going to say, "Screw it, I'm going to go up now." So, I don't know.
Or the theory that I just thought of, I thought you were going at, he beats Edwards for the welterweight title and then they shoot him up into the champ realm possibility, and he goes after whoever's holding middleweight.
That's a relative possibility too. Yep.
All right, that's interesting. And then you have, I lost my place because I was going back. Okay, 308 Madison Square Garden. You put November 16th. I curse you, because 1 week earlier would be my birthday.
I know, but something tells me that week is going to be a fight night card, though. So I just figured as much. So.
I guess I should be too surprised because 2019 they had November 2nd as 244, and the next week was the fight night. So there's that. And then 309, you have T-Mobile Arena, December 14th, O'Malley on 2, which makes sense. But 308 at the Garden, you have a whole realm of possibilities here.
I do. You want to read them?
Okay. I'm going to go from logical to where the hell are you going with this?
Okay.
Covington versus Usman 3. I guess I could see it. Although, if neither one of those guys have the belts, I guess wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, this is that Covington somehow beats Edwards. So that's my theory. Yeah.
Okay. McGregor Poirier 4. I mean, they have teased that fight on one end, but if McGregor doesn't beat Chandler, I don't see that fight happening.
Okay, fair.
I think McGregor versus Gaethje could be a bigger possibility because McGregor has teased he wants the BMF title.
That's true, but Gaethje's had a better last 3 years than Conor, so logically, does the fight make sense? Probably not.
Last 3 years. Zain, last 3 years. I'd say it lasts better 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, that's true. I was being generous considering that Conor did beat Donald Cerrone, so that's why I said.
Then you have Jones Miocic versus TBA or Volkov versus Aspinall Sergey. So in other words, a heavyweight title fight based on whatever the hell happens in this November and whatever the hell happens in the first half of 2024.
That is exactly right. Yep.
Okay, that one I should have read first because I think that actually makes the most sense. But here's where we get into the realm of left field. Nate Diaz return versus 2BA.
Yeah, you want to talk about craziness at Madison Square Garden? That would be as crazy as it could possibly get. So,
a Francis Ngannou surprise return. Unless disaster happens with the PFL, I say no.
Okay.
But we've seen crazy things happen. And then Brock Lesnar? Are you suggesting some sort of crossover with this whole TKO thing?
100% yes. Yeah.
Just as long as he's not a what did he call himself? A jacked up white boy and then test positive for performance enhancers.
Yeah, he did.
All right. So interesting outlook here for 2024. Nice to play matchmaker and schedule maker. But now, Zain, it's time to get angry. We talked about Mexican Independence Day weekend next year, about Grasso Shevchenko 3, and I said, well, it has to be that way. Why? Because Grasso retained the title, but it was a rare and controversial split draw. You had one judge for Grasso, one judge for Shevchenko, and then you had one judge scoring the bout a draw. So I want to get the scorecards because I texted them to you up here, so I formally read them correctly. Sal D'Amato scored the bout 48-47 Shevchenko. Junichiro Kamijo scored it 48-47 Grasso. And then Mike Bell scores the bout 47-47. And the reason we have a 47-47 is because he scored the only 10-8 round of that fight, scoring the fifth and final round 10-8 in favor of Grasso.
Which it simply wasn't a 10-8 round. I mean, you don't have to be an MMA expert to know that round 5 of one of the best flyweight title fights ever was not a 10-8 round because it simply wasn't.
So the logic that has been going around the MMA Twitterverse is that basically the 10-8 was given because Grasso took mount essentially and pounded away on Shevchenko for a little while and could have gotten the finish there. Here's my problem with that logic, Zain.
Okay.
If that is a 10-8 round, then by theory, when Shevchenko had a chokehold on Grasso in the third round, and I thought it was going to be over at that point, should that not also be a 10-8 round by that logic?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So where Mike Bell is going with this, I don't know. Although it was Zain, I don't know if you saw this tweet out there or the I can't be bothered to call it the X at this point. That tweet out there that Mike Bell was giving out 10-8 rounds. He was really the only judge who was really, giving him out in all the fights that he was judging.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. He was also the same judge that scored the Kevin Holland JDM fight 30-27, which was downright madness. And I'm almost positive that he was the same judge that gave a 30-27 scorecard in the Kyle Nelson fight too.
So either he's sleeping during the fights, or Zain, we have to have a discussion again about, well, what the hell is a 10-8 round? Because prior to 2017, when the ABC went through their whole, changes that saw the unified rules become the ununified rules of mixed martial arts, as I like to say, 10-8 rounds were very rare and were really saved for the domination kind of rounds. Now the criteria has kind of changed. I know Sean Gian just put out a video going over the criteria, but I just can't seem to buy any sort of argument that round 5 was a 10-8 round for Grasso. I think she wins the round, but not 10-8.
No, and I actually had Grasso winning the fight, didn't you?
No, actually, I disagreed. I sided with Sal D'Amato and his scorecard where I gave 1, 3, and 4 to Shevchenko, and I gave 2 and 5 to Grasso. I think.
So what is your rationale for giving Val round 4, in your opinion, from what you remember about it?
I think Shevchenko just had the better control and striking during that round. Although I will admit, I think that's their toss-up round. I think that's the one where it could have gone either way. Because if this fight had been ruled Zain, 48-47 Shevchenko or 48-47 Grasso, I wouldn't have complained. It was a great fight. It was competitive. And, that's just how the bullet bites when it's the judges. But when you're inserting something really stupid, like a 10-8 round that Mike Bell gave out for that 5th round, because Zain, if that's a 10-9, Shevchenko wins the belt back on a controversial split decision. So that's why I said before, as much as, it's a split draw, and as much as Shevchenko hurt her thumb in that fight, we don't know how long she's going to be out. I think she has every right to an as immediate as possible rematch. I think a trilogy fight is a must at this point.
1,000%. And all the people talking about that she's being disrespectful with her disappointment in the judges, I'd say let her have her moment. She thought she won the fight. She felt like the fight was taken away from her. I think the way you act after a fight like that is you just need to let your emotions run high. As long as you're not threatening anyone or saying anything that's enticing or disrespectful, which she really wasn't. She was being critical of the judges. I don't find that disrespectful at all. And if I was in her situation, I would be just as upset as she was.
Well, here's the thing, Zain. Number one, you're right. The post-fight comments from both women were absolutely, you were spot on. They were respectful. Grasso, you had the funny moment of Grasso saying that she won the fight, and then DC saying, but it was a draw. Grasso's point was that she retained the belt. But, both women held respect for one another. It was a competitive fight. It was a great fight. It was a great women's flyweight showcase. The problem here is, Valentina's right. Because how many times, Zain, what repercussions do you think Mike Bell is going to have after that 10-8?
None.
Exactly my point.
Bob Bennett retired in Nevada, and Nevada's going to Nevada. We know how this goes.
So here it is again, where we should have the judges, fighters have to be held accountable for what they do in the cage. Funny that you mentioned that, Zain. If Val in the middle of the octagon went on a 1 to 2 minute tirade, dropping F-bombs and S-bombs and making the mouse blush,
they would have done something like they always do. But of course, when it's actually important, like a championship fight where the belt could change hands, they do nothing about it.
Right. When a judge makes a screw up, they're not held accountable. And it's only after some really serious backlash, like I think of the classic example with Nevada, the 118-110 Canelo scorecard Adelaide Bird gave out in the first Canelo Triple G fight.
The same with Pacquiao Bradley 1. Remember the outrage after that? Yeah.
Yeah. That's the thing. They wait for the most backlash kind of behavior.
Anything to happen possible, they wait for anything that isn't considered asinine to them. They don't even bat an eye about
it. It's unreal. You would think by this point where it's 2023 and saying, you had a Chris Tognoni screw up earlier in the card. They went to replay review and the fight became a no contest after the whole submission when the guy was relaxing himself, was thought to have passed out.
Which he was never out.
Right. But people's logic was that, he had gone limp. But when you hear the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu mind, it's that when you're in a submission like that, you're supposed to relax your body as a means to escape the submission. That's why Cormier was calling for, if you ever see a WWE match where the fighter, when one of the wrestlers in the chokehold, they drop the arm like 3 times to make that's what it should be.
Right. 100%.
But my point here is that, it's late 2023. Judges should be held accountable. They should give, written or spoken reasons why they scored a fight as they did. But as you mentioned, Nevada's going to Nevada.
Right, and trust me, if it wasn't in Nevada, this would not have happened.
But of course, it happened.
That's my theory. So,
but I mean, at least we can say since Grasso retained, it was an excellent fight, and UFC, to play on Dana's words, didn't F up their chance at the Mexican market.
No, because now they get a gift in a trilogy fight that's going to be huge. Yeah.
And Rosas won his fight. The card was okay for what it was, at least okay, if not good. And they're going to be going back to Mexico supposedly now for a fight night card in 24.
And they can rebook Sharaz again because he has unfinished business too. So
yeah. So they actually didn't screw this up. There you go.
They didn't. Thank goodness.
The only ones who screwed up is the athletic commission, because of course they did.
Yes, 1,000%. And that same athletic commission is going to be back in the center of attention because we have another Apex card, Tom.
Oh, wait, I'm supposed to do the happy Apex. I mean, I like this fight. It's just, this should be an international card. Come on.
I know. I'm going to say this is going to be another really closely contested fight, but Fiziev is going to edge Gamrot 48-47 on at least two of the judges' scorecards. I just think his striking is better than Gamrot. I think Fiziev is going to stuff at least 3 takedowns, and I think he'll walk out of Vegas the rightful winner and continue to remain a contender in a very competitive division and a division that could have a lot of shift and change in the next 7 to 8 months. What do you think?
I'm going to agree with you. I think Fiziev stuffs Gamrot's takedown attempts. I think his striking is better, as you said. I could see 48-40. I don't know if I can say splits. I could see 48-47s or 49-46s in Fiziev's favor. And Zain, I mean, Fiziev at this point is on the doorstep, and I think this fight is going to get him the upper echelon of that division.
1,000%.
This is a big opportunity for him. Also, big opportunity, co-main event, Dan Ige, Bryce Mitchell. Zain, I think a win over Dan Ige would mean the world for somebody like Bryce Mitchell.
Oh, yeah, and I think he's going to get it. I mean, he's been training profusely for this fight. I mean, just look at his Instagram. It's the most motivated I've ever seen Bryce Mitchell in his career so far. And I think he's going to get a thunderous knockout of 50K Ige in at least the second round. I would say about 1:40 in. I think he's been Bryce Mitchell is gonna blow the roof off at the Apex with about the 100 people that are going to be there. And it's going to be one of those Apex knockouts that you'll remember where you were when it happened. And I think it's going to put a lot of people on notice that Bryce Mitchell is one of the best young stars the UFC has. And I think he's going to deliver a virtuoso performance, if you will.
And you know what's funny is that we've also seen Bryce Mitchell. We've seen how slick he is with submissions too. So who's not to say that he could get a submission on here? But yeah, I think with Bryce Mitchell and how hard he is trained, he is going to finish Dan Ige. If he doesn't finish him, it's going to be an absolutely one-sided, no question about it, decision. This is going to be, hopefully for Bryce Mitchell, a huge breakout moment for him on this card.
100%.
We've also got Bellator this weekend. We've got what could potentially, Zain, be the third to last Bellator in promotional history, depending on how this thing with the PFL goes. Middleweight title on the line. It's Johnny Eblen defending against the brother of UFC welterweight champ Leon Edwards, Fabian Edwards. This will be an absolutely competitive fight, and I think this fight, Zain, deserves in what seems to be Bellator traditions and more hype than it's actually getting.
Yeah, I'm going to say Eblen third round sub here. I just think the middleweight division is his to give up, and no disrespect to Fabian Edwards, but Fabian Edwards to me is still very green in his career. He doesn't have as much experience as his brother, and I think Eblen will exploit Edwards' weaknesses. I think it'll be a great fight. I just see Eblen holding on to the middleweight title for as long as he can. I mean, once he beat Gegard Mousasi, he's been a completely different fighter, and I really like his game at the moment, and I think he's going to give the Irish crowd something to cheer about for sure, and it's going to be a good one.
I don't think he's going to get a finish. However, I do think it's going to be a clear unanimous decision in his favor. I think he's going to have a couple of good submission attempts on Fabian Edwards, so I think Edwards will be able to get out of it. And I just think that Eblen's striking, I think it's going to be competitive. I think Eblen's striking is just going to be more effective and powerful. I'm going to go Eblen one-sided decision, retains the title. Also worth noting with Bellator 299, Zain, their co-main events, you got Aaron Pico taking on Pedro Carvalho.
Yeah, I mean, this is a must-win for Aaron Pico. If he doesn't win this fight, I'm gonna be pretty concerned. And I actually think Pico uses his wrestling, takes him to the ground, wins a clear TKO mid-second round. I think this is a coming-out party and a statement for Pico. What do you think?
I think for Pico, he needs some sort of finish to get back some momentum. I'm going to say second or third round finish.
Okay.
And that is going to do it for this edition of the MMA Outsiders. We hope you had just as much fun as we did. Before we get out of here, hit that like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified of everything here at the Empty the Bench Network, every episode of the MMA Outsiders, and so much more. Follow us across social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok. Instagram at MMA Outsiders ETB. Follow the Empty Bench Podcast Network, Facebook, X, TikTok, and Instagram at ETB Network. To my right, as always, Sam Bando. You can find his work over at bjpen.com, Bellator Rankings Committee member. Follow him on social media at SamBando99. I'm Tom Albano. You can find my work over at Fansided MMA and with the Professional Fighters League for at least for the rest of the 2023 season. And you can follow me on social media at Thomas J. Albano. Before we get out of here, just want to say enjoy the fights this weekend. Sam, I want to give you a early happy birthday shout out.
Thank you.
And last but not least, as we always say here, be Joe Pyfer.
Be Joe Pyfer. Enjoy the fights this weekend. A bit of a smaller load, but thank you again for hanging in there with us. This has been episode 54 of the MMA Outsiders. We will catch you guys on the other side for next week, where we will preview all the happenings that is Canelo versus Charlo from Vegas. So stay tuned and tune in because you won't want to miss it.
Yep. See you then.